I'm here with Vinay Gupta, a man who needs no introduction, but he's a humanitarian systems designer. And would you like to introduce me from your perspective? That'd be fun.
Sure. I mean, you're a freelance intellectual attempting to straighten out a whole bunch of our worst cultural misunderstandings.
Yeah, perfect. So should we jump right into the meta crisis?
Yeah, let's do it. So, I mean, you've done a lot of thinking around meta crisis, and I've done a lot of thinking around individual crisis. You know, nukes, pandemics, state failure, all the rest of these things. But I've never worked systemically on those issues at a political level. So, was it Weinstein who originally started this thing of like, you know, the fundamental cause of all of these problems is that we've got competition rather than cooperation in critical areas. What if there was another way of doing it? Then, you know, Schmachtenberger picks up that torch, and you know that becomes this kind of somewhat disembodied game B narrative. And then alongside of that, I think sneaks this meta crisis story, which is, by the way, all of the things which are fucked in an integral way. Is that a fair summary for
Well,
starters?
yeah, they kind of crash into each other because the meta crisis discourse goes back to the 70s at least, and a lot of the research of these different fields overlap, right? And so, you know, the Club of Rome, which Thomas Bjorkman is a member of, right? They had their limits to growth report, and I think either in there or in another report, they had 49 continuous critical problems, right? It was like a list of these specific things. And actually the first thing was like population growth, because it was just, it's a generator of these sorts of crises at the root level. And then there was other things like, you know, terrorism and stuff, but it's all connected, and they called them meta problems. And so for me, the meta crisis is, you know, the deep kind of narratives and kind of path dependence that allows, you know, or enables all this to unfold. And when we talk about crises like climate change, or, you know, the education sector, or, you know, financial crises, or pandemics, for example, they're all underpinned and overdetermined is a more appropriate word, right? Because there's so many factors that cause these things. Whereas the opposite would be kind of scaffolding and protection to make sure that these things don't happen, right? Yeah, so that kind of discourse goes back far, but then, you know, it's one of the things that brings us together in the meta modern community. But then, yeah, as we've discussed, there's overlap and intersections with the game B community, and I'm not sure if they used it before initially, but they definitely use it now.
Yeah, I feel like the meta crisis thing was in many ways game B beginning to sort itself out a little. Like, okay, you know, so there is actually a single interwoven problem here. That problem is, you know, multifaceted, yada yada. But, you know, the notion of game B is the thing that you deploy to fix the meta crisis, I think, is the kind of shorthand that a lot of people have for game B. But they're very interested in solutioneering and not very interested in understanding the meta crisis.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a problem within game B and within metamodernism too, and within academia and different think tanks, is people don't realize the depth to which we reproduce the meta crisis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, there's just so many ways, and it can be just in terms of your footprint. Obviously, that's a big issue for you, and your footprint is multiplied if you have children, and also in behavior, right? So both game B and metamodern people and integral people have different protocols for interaction and stuff. You know, different therapies that they use on themselves and on other people to scaffold up. But then there's, you know, you quickly discover kind of double standards and hypocrisies, like, you know, that like these ideas of just certain standards for communication, and of course it's all skewed through the internet and through text-based communication as well. But, you know, some common ground is that we're kind of post-capitalist in aspiration, right? So we agree that capitalism is this driving force that compels us to make a lot of these mistakes over and over again. You know, on a simple level, it's just the profit level, because so many people are are bound to their paychecks.
I mean, this is the thing about, is capitalism an efficient way of allocating capital? Right? Like, capitalism's claim is that it's the best possible way of allocating capital. And at the point where capitalism is no longer the best way of allocating capital, capitalism no longer has its central claim to legitimacy.
It's a good way of moving capital. Whether it's a good way of allocating capital is a separate question.
So there's an old article called "In Soviet Union, Scheduling Problem Solves You." And basically what it examines is the possibility of quantum socialism, where the core economic problem that capitalism in theory solves efficiently is the scheduling problem, which is how do you marshal the physical resources to produce the most efficient outputs. And that problem is, NP complete or NP hard or something like that. It's completely resistant to classical algorithms. The argument is that capitalism is basically a genetic algorithm for solving that problem. Right? Capital is invested back in the things that work, and it's like a greedy genetic algorithm. And that article says, well, in theory, if you've got quantum computers, then you can solve the scheduling problem with a perfect output, because you've got so much computing power that specifically solves those kind of combinatorial problems, that you can very quickly imagine a society in which you simply don't have waste because the machine is all knowing and all doing. And that, I think, is quite interesting, because it kind of cracks open this question about what is the necessary technological substrate for socialism. Right? It's pretty clear that if you do socialism with industrial tooling, most of the time you get death camps. Right?
Yeah.
And I refer to this as being the socialism like logic bomb, that on paper the code looks fine, then you run the code, then you get death camps.
Yeah.
Like, well, I didn't realize when we were doing this we were signing up for death camps. Well, no, I don't think you were. But where did it come? It's like a logic bomb in the code of socialism. And socialism is kind of unsafe at any speed, because we know that very often when you compile and run the code, you get things like Stalinism. Well, that wasn't what we had in mind. So this notion of is that a technological problem? Is it that socialism just doesn't work at an industrial technology level, but it might work at a much higher technology level?
Yeah.
Kind of, sort of, maybe. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think we're getting there, and a lot of my work does go in that direction. However, as soon as you said the technological substrate, I thought about, the social substrate, because we're still pretty far from that necessary,
close on the social substrate. So I before we got on the call, I was sitting down and watching a chunk of Netflix's version of the Ramayana. Right, the Ramayana is one of the two big Indian myths. So Ramayana is mostly about the doings of gods, and Mahabharata is largely about the doings of men. And the entire show is an adventure story about a bunch of people that are massively in love with each other and super devoted to each other. So, entire family groups, aunts, uncles, grandparents are just they have this profound reverence for each other. And then they're interacting with a bunch of hobgoblins that want to screw up their plans. Right? But the sort of spiritual, social, familial unity and familial loyalty that are at the heart of that story are, they ring like a bell, right? You have these long sort of 20 or 30-second scenes, which are just all of the family members sagely nodding as somebody is talking and exchanging these kind of looks of approval, like, yes, this is our map. Yes, this is amazing. Then I switched over to an Australian TV show where they locked 8 comics in a basement with a huge variety of props, and the last person to laugh wins $100,000. Right? And these people are professional peers. They've been set against each other. There are no limits because there's no audience, so they do whatever it takes to try and get that laugh, and they're systematically trying to eliminate each other. And the difference in conception of what a human being is for,
right,
between those two experiences, it's like, oh, this is why I can't function in Western society. I did all this meditation stuff. I became enlightened when I was probably, 26? I've been enlightened for almost half my life at this point. Pretty close. the spiritual values of Asia are really all that makes sense to me. And capitalism looks like the goblins from one of these old Indian epics just got hold of the controls and are attempting to crash the ship into the cliff for fun. Like, it's becoming harder and harder for me to look at capitalism as anything other than demonic in the way that it's currently practiced. And I don't mean that in a literal sense, but, the notion that there are, in some sense, frequencies of consciousness and that we're stuck in a very low one is valid. But on the other hand, the recipes for getting us out of that mess that people propose are clearly nonsense. So
yeah, and what I'm about to say is a little bit of an oversimplification, but the what capitalism does to society, we have on one hand this kind of general progress, right? Piecemeal change, incrementalism.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
they would, you can say empirically things are getting better, but on the other hand, especially the past 50 years of neoliberalism, I think of it in terms of this, it tilts the whole political spectrum sideways, so everything slips to the right.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So the Democrats are
when
more right wing than
when the
they used to be.
Soviets stopped being a threat,
Yeah.
the whole political spectrum has just
Right.
slid right with no restraint.
Yeah, and it's often, people point to like fishhook theory as a meme to kind of capture this. And so, this is why I think a lot of people are confused, because capitalism is distorting us ideologically, right? And instead of being self-aware, people like dig in and rationalize what's happening, so you have all these so-called centrist people who are actually representing pretty crazy ideas, like that are anti-left and anti-far right. So
yeah, I mean so the Democratic Party now looks to me like it's got roughly the same political opinion as George Bush the First did.
Well, and George Bush Jr. endorsed Biden, didn't he? So it's all coming full circle.
Yeah. But I mean that logjam is like not that big a deal as long as you don't have a dying planet.
Right.
Like if that was just America's political culture is really broken right now, give it 58 years, they'll sort themselves out. Yeah, that's okay. But at this point, we don't really have 50 or 8 years.
Right.
I mean,
it's the pendulum politics, and we don't have time for that shit anymore.
Yeah. Pendulum politics, but also, I mean, neither end of that pendulum is remotely realistic about the global situation. Yeah. So it's all very well having a pendulum, but if the pendulum is swinging backwards and forwards like this, and the problem is somewhere up here, and no bueno. So, I mean, 2002, I started working on handling 30 million climate refugees. Sorry, 300 million climate refugees. And I figured it was going to take me 30 years to get it done, right? Just to get a deployable global capability, I figured it was going to take 30 years because everything that I'd seen from like structure of scientific revolutions told me that paradigm changes take 30 years, right? 15 years to get the first group of people well and up to speed on your paradigm, and then another 15 years for that paradigm to spread to the point where it has any kind of global impact. So, 2002, I would have been 30. I figured out that this thing was going to be done by the time I was 60. I'm now 3/5 of the way into that, right? 18 years into the Hexiart project, we've got live refugees living in a Hexiart derivative called the Shift Pod. The acceleration of the climate mess makes it pretty obvious that 12 years from now, it's very likely that we are going to have enormous numbers of Hexiart type things deployed because people are going to get pushed out of their homes at such a rate. But, that course of action, even though it's been entirely rational, I still can't count 20 people in the world that understand that I'm literally planning for 300 million refugees.
Right. Yeah. And somebody's got to do it.
Here are the technologies to stop these people dying, right? If we don't develop these technologies, they will all die because nobody will pay to keep them alive. We have to figure out a way of doing this. And even though everybody's running around like, climate, when you sit down and say, okay, so, numbers say, actually, it could be well over 1 billion displaced by 2050, right? Like, that's like 1/8 of the human race. Now we're really talking big numbers, right? If it costs you $1,000 a family to move 1 billion people, you're pretty soon talking about like defense level budgets just to move these people. And there's a psychological barrier that seems to stop people understanding that this is the future.
Yeah. And it's funny because we expend tons of imagination in films and stuff and books too, imagining this, but a lot of it like either misses the mark or misses the point, or it does not come back into our praxis and into what we're developing.
Yeah, because I mean the habitual tendency of people to do the same thing that their parents did, or as close as they can get to it, I think is overwhelming all of the intelligence about what's happening in the future.
Yeah.
The sort of ethological return to base. We did this yesterday, we're going to do it tomorrow. That's just how it is. That kind of tendency, I think, is so powerful that it's very, very, very hard for people to overcome it. And that's extremely worrying. Because if people don't realize that what climate change means is your children will live in hell, it's quite hard to move them. And then we've got nukes and biotechnology and nanotechnology and, methane emissions and whatever the heck else is, like this is your whole meta crisis thing of like every one of these systems is connected to every other one of these systems. And if you begin to cut through that stack, the risk is the kind of spontaneous large scale collapse. And yeah, I mean, I'm still unconsciously braced for that.
Yeah. One thing that pops into my head when you mention your refugee hexayurts is the idea of, and this is, I mean, your immediate rebuttal would be something along the lines of, well, it's going to take so much energy and materials to produce this. But what pops into my head is the idea of like manufactured homes in those kind of shipping containers.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
So I've seen prototypes, but it's like, it's 2020. Like why, it feels like the world is so behind the curve on this.
Mm-hmm.
And, but it's a way to scale up the solution with the technology that's becoming, increasingly advanced and granular and, artificial intelligence.
And I mean, the critical thing that you nailed there is how far the world is behind in preparing for what is to come. Right. And it's that conceptual gap, right? So the meta crisis thing of all of these interlocking systems that are under strain. I didn't realize that concept went back as far as the Club of Rome. So the notion that is fraying to pieces and the whole thing is going apeshit. And then, what's your chosen intervention point on that, right? So the game B intervention point is basically competition is the enemy. How do we eliminate the competition mindset? Great, right? The game B has so far as I can tell, not generated a single concrete policy proposal.
Yeah, they aggregate a lot of stuff too, which is great. But touching on the rivalry point, obviously they are a bit rivalrous because you and I both got kicked out.
Oh yeah,
in a kind of competitive way. And
their actual culture is that they are bastards. Right? I mean, there's just no two ways about it. Do you know Visa? The Visa Corporation had this very, very flexible, fluid, decentralized governance model they called chaotix, right? But the running joke was that Dee Hock, who was the founder of Visa, was the most hard-bitten, rigid, authoritarian son of a bitch that anybody had ever seen, right? So the flexible, decentralized model worked because at the heart of it, you had an autocrat, right? Very much like you see with open source, like you build a flexible, decentralized model, and then you put an authoritarian bastard on top of that pile. And that's kind of the game B flavor, that they have a fundamentally authoritarian praxis, even though they're talking about a non-competitive future. Their actual way of doing things is brutally authoritarian.
Yeah.
As we both encountered, right?
Yeah.
So the thing about the conflict knot is this. Rendered as absolutely clear economic theory, this post-conflict model has some great examples, right? The primary one of these, well, you could think of all the stuff about commons management, right? Ostrom, this kind of thing. Can you figure out ways of cooperatively managing commons so that everybody does better than they would if you don't do that? Great approach, fantastic. We ought to do that. Very nice. But it's not getting done.
Yeah.
Talking about it's not getting done. And if it's not getting done, what do we have left, right?
Yeah, a related irony is, Game B in principle is, against war, but they're not above kind of, employing or advocating it. And demilitarization is a huge principle for me. And because in terms of the meta crisis, right? So, if you read any political theory or history, there's a certain, realism and path dependence, as we've said, about war, like, and as they would say in Game B, like game theory, like there's a kind of determinism to war, right? Like, okay, historically I get it, historically, because that's, you have people separated, they don't have phones, they're separated by distance, they have scarce resources, there's all sorts of inputs that make that the logical evolutionary track, right? Okay, but things are changing. And my theoretical ideas of metamodernism and the metaconvergence kind of presuppose an inversion of that. And if we're to steelman Game B, that's what they want too. But it really is becoming increasingly obvious that, like, you can't solve any of these problems through violence. But not only that, the premise that we're trying to overturn here is that governance is presupposed or predicated on the threat of force. Like, the definition of the state in some political theory, like Hobbes is, and Weber perhaps, is that the state is legitimate because it has the monopoly on the use of force. But that doesn't work anymore to incentivize people to be good. What incentivizes people to be good is education, a little bit of income, maybe some community stuff to do. That's what we're trying to scale up.
So this is where we have a very different model. So I want to talk a little bit about the legitimacy of the state, and then let's talk about what we mean by good, right? Because this is the kind of hardcore philosophical fundamental stuff that there's very little discourse on, right? We've almost entirely stopped thinking in moral philosophy terms when it comes to trying to design futures, and I think that's a huge mistake, because a lot of these problems are moral philosophy problems. So used to work a bunch on failed states, right? So when you look at failed states, you get a very different sense of what the state is, because you get to see the state in a different phase of its existence, right? The state in its fully featured healthy form has monopoly on violence, but the state, when it's going wrong, begins to lose monopoly on violence. And then you get weird situations like Gaza, where you've got about 5 entities that are all capable of doing violence without any reprisals in that area, in which sense they're all kind of sort of the state. And so when I looked at this, what I came to the conclusion is this: it's not the monopoly of violence which is the important part about being a state, right? Because, for example, US government de facto doesn't have the monopoly on violence in a whole bunch of places, and hasn't had for a century. Like the Chicago mob, there was no monopoly of violence on Chicago. Either the police or the mob were capable of mounting war to the point where nobody would interfere in their business. So, monopoly on violence are broken down. So the model that I use is this. The state is any entity that has the ability to retroactively or proactively pardon criminal behavior.
Yeah.
Right? So you proactively pardon assault, you get police. You proactively pardon murder, you get armies. And you proactively pardon theft, you get tax collectors. Right? And the retroactive stuff is, your intelligence agents get caught blowing something up and they kill somebody they shouldn't have, and the problem just kind of mysteriously goes away. That framing of the state, I think, is quite useful, because it permits multiple hierarchies or overlapping state-like entities to share a single geography. And I think that is a really important insight, because land was largely valuable because it generated food, and food was money.
Yeah, this reminds me of the expression "decide the exception," which I just Googled, and people like Carl Schmitt, I guess, talks about that. And I think that sounds like what you're talking about. Like, it's not just the use of force, but the ability, broadly, to decide the exception, to have authority over the discourse, the regime, and as you say, retroactively, decide the history, as it were. That's what the United States does.
It's the ability to create power, right?
Yeah.
So Then what comes from that is the question about, the ability of multiple jurisdictions to overlap is much higher in that model than in the Weberian model, right? So if we start talking about global governance and global jurisdictions, their ability to overlay over the nation states is quite strong in the model which is about pardoning of crime, rather than in the geographical model, which doesn't allow any kind of overlaid sovereignty. And I don't see a future that works without an enormous amount of overlaid sovereignty.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, when I was at the DoD, I did a little bit of work for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and a lot of the model that I was talking about was the idea that America had become de facto sort of para-state, that it exhibited state-like attributes across a much wider geography than just America. And the question was how to legitimize those state-like attributes, because if they didn't legitimize it, they were going to lose it. And, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the rest of that.
Yeah.
And I think that this is one of the things, I was never a soldier. I was never in a uniform. But I've spent a lot of years around extremely senior military people. And I think that this is probably the key distinction between my perspective and the Game B perspective. Because to me, it all resolves in violence. Right? It's control of violence which dictates the future of the world. If the violence is in the hands of idiots that use the violence for idiotic ends and overuse it, you wind up with enormous defense budgets, huge numbers of dead people in a ruined world. If the violence is in the hands of, god kings or, warrior saints or whatever it happens to be, it's hardly ever deployed. The economic costs are kept manageable so it doesn't cripple your societies, and the world will bloom very nicely. And, this notion that we've lost control of the sword and it's fallen into the hands of evil men, to me is just a very simple summary of how we got here, right? And that notion that, is it about being post-violence, or is it just about making sure that the violence is only in the hands of the just? That's kind of a knife edge.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, because I'm advocating for scaling it down, and eventual elimination, right? A kind of Star Trek, The Next Generation kind of future. But of course, there'll always be kind of
Starfleet is quite an expensive, heavily armed military. We might have gotten the military off Earth, but we still have a hell of a military apparatus in Starfleet.
Right. Like the weapons are still there, right?
Oh, yeah.
But it's the weaponry is overwhelmed, if that's a functional word here, by the humanitarian spirit, right? So it's
it's the wise sword rather than the stupid sword.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's for self-defense, right? It's very, very principled.
Yeah, that's right. And they're pretty post-colonialist, right? The Federation are not much for this expansion.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this is quite. Let's see if I can fish something out here. So one of the best models of what went wrong in America is that they failed to cut the defense budget in the 1990s. Right? We had essentially 10 years of world peace in the 1990s. The federales didn't succeed in cutting their defense spending at all. Yeah. And the result of that was basically that by the time 9/11 rolled around, they had a ton of hardware that they were waiting for a chance to use and a bunch of soldiers that had never seen a war.
Yeah.
And you put those two things together and you tend to get, the insanity begins, right? So if the US had gone about a serious cut in Pentagon budget and had plowed that into kind of a Swords into Plowshares type program, the defense contractors start building space hardware or whatever it is, they could have maintained the overall defense Keynesianism where the US economy runs on deficit spending to maintain a technical apparatus. But they also could have begun the path of global demilitarization. And I think that there is a really tangible opportunity here. And sorry, this has taken us completely off the track we were on, but it's something that's been on my mind. So maybe some of the folks that listen to this will have an opinion on it. So if we imagine that the international climate treaties are tied to a coordinated cut in defense spending, and that's where we liberate the money for, we've done this before for nuclear weapons, right? We had SALT 1 and SALT 2 and various other treaties, anti-ballistic missile treaty and a bunch of other stuff, which seriously reduced the amount of money that was being spent making nuclear weapons and also reduce the volatility of the weapons in the arsenal by getting rid of things like first strike and anti-missile missiles, the things that created a higher probability of somebody just jacking somebody. We got rid of most of those capabilities. We severely limited research in those areas. So in that sort of model, could you convince the Chinese that the Pentagon was going to cut its budget by 20% over 10 years, and we'd like them to do the same with their military spending? Could you actually cut that deal with China? And I think the answer is maybe.
Yeah, I mean, going back to doing all things at once, like let's do that, but also, keeping in mind that other military budgets are but a fraction of what the US is, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
the key is to do that, but also like invest in the UN and build out the UN, like the UN, for whatever the new incarnation we want to call, it can have its own force, but it shouldn't be hyper militarized, right? Like we need to demilitarize the military, so you have social workers and negotiators and peacemakers, not profiteers, right?
But I mean, this is the kind of Star Trek option, right?
Yeah,
this is the assumption that we have a wise enough hand at the planetary tiller we can get things like this done.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that bankrupt, decrepit, broken nation states that are trying to hold together their social stability might be willing to come to the table and actually just cut defense spending. Because, I mean, I don't know how to say this exactly.
I think they have to agree as well on this idea from modern monetary theory on how the state can print and spend money, right? So if that action is also coordinated, also with synchronous policy shifts, then we can start to converge towards these common goals. The things that as you say, with like the Millennium Development Goals of the UN, like they're too abstract, they're a bit absurd. But if we can actually put the kind of guardrails on this thing, then it can start to work.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there is a very tricky edge here, isn't there? The utopian and the pragmatic have to dance a very careful dance, because we've had 50, 60 years of utopian politics coming out of the San Francisco Age of Aquarius mass awakening thing. And, my opinion on that, as a professional meditation, practitioner, is it's all horseshit from one end to the other, right? There's just no way. I've seen the kind of work that individual awakening takes, and mass awakening is a multiple of individual awakening. It's just not happening. And that leaves us in a position where we've got a very constrained solution set, because we have to solve this problem with the people we have, not with the people that we want. And, you can look at that and become hopeless, or we can say, look, we managed to avoid nuclear war, even though the conditions were perfect. Right? I mean, if you think of America having the only nuclear bombs in the world in the mid to late 1940s, early 1950s,
right,
the Americans could have flattened Russia in a weekend and didn't. They could have said, if we even hear the word uranium coming out of Moscow, we're going to pave it.
Yeah.
Do it.
It's so complicated because, I'm not a historian, but there's different theories about Japan, like whether it needed to be nuked, So, like you said about kind of retconning history, they can decide after the fact that, it did. And then also there's the issue from the Japanese perspective too. Like they have textbook controversies about how they tell their own history.
Oh yeah.
And, it's a big moral philosophical problem, as you said.
Oh
and
God.
Because
politics at Nagasaki are unbelievably foul.
Yeah. And Japan perpetrated all sorts of evils, so they did reckon with it, right? That's why today Germany and Japan are such relatively peaceful and economically mature countries.
Absolutely. If America had come out of World War II with the same level of defense spending that Japan and Germany did, probably Stalin would have ruled everything down to the southern border of Algeria, but other histories. So I want to draw attention to the brute force and ignorance approach that I think will work, right? So I don't believe in the naive game B modeling of cooperation is the answer. I think it is possible that there are sophisticated reads along the line of Ostrom's commons governance work that would make that work, but I don't see that discourse anywhere inside of game B. To me, they've just gotten lost. No solutions are coming out of that movement. So the tack that I took when I was working on this stuff intensively 10 years ago was a different track, which became known as the black elephant.
Yeah, I
So-
like this term. I wasn't really familiar before, but it sounds good.
So we had an outfit called the Institute for Collapsonomics, which was a kind of Bourbaki-style effort where a bunch of people came together, did a bunch of thinking, published a bunch of work, some of it named, some of it not named. Basically, collapsonomics was this idea of studying collapsing systems or failed systems with the same kind of tools that we use in economics. So to ask questions about, so what is the actual ecology of commerce inside of a collapsing state? And we had all the former Soviet Union examples. We did the 2008 bust here. It wasn't a dumb question. We did a bunch of work on it, and everybody laughed at us. We had a fantastic meeting with the National Endowment for Science, Technology, and Arts here, NESTA. And we rolled in with about 7 or 8 people and just laid out, look, you know, we could be looking at 25% budget cuts to the UK budget in 10 years. Right, the economy could crack completely. There's no guarantee finance stays up. And they basically just laughed us out. They were like, oh, it's the wrong part of the economic cycle. Everything is recovering. It's like, oh, is that so? Is that so? Well, no. We'll see how it goes, right? This is part of what pushed me into Ethereum.
Yeah, and
So-
just to define quickly for clarification, right, the black elephant is a rare but significant risk that everybody knows about, but no one wants to discuss.
Precisely.
Or,
right?
I'm just
So-
reading that off, yeah, or something that changes everything, but no one wants to deal with.
That's right. So I think our key here is wrangling the black elephants is an achievable goal in exactly the same way that cooperative consciousness isn't. Right? I could put 15 people into a room and I can make those sons of bitches actually deal with the shit that they don't want to deal with.
Yeah.
Right? They will not thank me. They will not pay me in most instances. And they will be very unhappy.
Yeah.
But it doesn't need to be done twice.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. This kind of segues, we can keep going on it, but it'll segue into the consensus building idea.
Absolutely.
And also, you know, I think we're both anti-TED, but the interesting thing is like the TED platform is attractive and inviting, right? So,
Well, I mean,
you know, if I had the resources, I would propose that sort of conference that sort of ropes
do you know
people
about-
in. But then
do you know about
it's
Marie
subversive.
Antoinette's sheep?
No.
So Marie Antoinette, right, the princess of Versailles. I don't think she was actually the princess, maybe the prince's girlfriend, anyway, whoever it was. Marie Antoinette, fabulously noble, French Revolution, famously says, let them eat cake, allegedly, right?
Mm-mm.
So the better story about Marie Antoinette is Marie Antoinette's sheep. So she liked to dress up as a shepherd girl and go out and, you know, take care of sheep. This was a thing that she liked to do, to make sure that, you know, she knew that she was a woman of the people and she understood the conditions of the peasantry and all the rest of that. So there were servants that would lovingly lather the sheep and then wash them in rose-scented soap, manicure the lawns, trim the hay, and all the rest of these things. And so she had this little kind of like, la 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 la. Look, I'm one of the people. Look, here I am among all the sheep.
Little
I'm doing-
Bo Peep.
Little Bo Peep, right? And you know, my recollection is she went to the guillotine, right? To me, TED is literally, not figuratively, literally Marie Antoinette's farm. Right? There's an enormous secret machinery underneath TED of
Yeah.
hugely exploited, you know, makers of PowerPoint slides and, you know, organizers of conference
Boy.
bookings, all the rest of that.
Yeah.
There's a huge underlying, you know, overworked, underpaid, technocratic slave machinery to
God.
get that show on the road.
What
and
is
then,
that?
and then the surface production
Yeah.
is this totally effortless display of intellectual virtuosity
Right.
in a single register of truth.
Yeah.
Right.
What does it say about TEDx, right? That's the kind of self-organized spin-off.
Because
you know,
everybody thinks if you copy the mannerisms
Yeah.
of the TED people,
Yeah.
one day you'll be able to afford to go to the real TED.
yeah. And some of it's good. We all have probably friends that have done TED Talks. I've never done one. I would do one if I was invited, but
Well,
two come
it's an
to
opportunity
mind.
to talk to
Yeah,
people.
exactly. Two come to mind as the anti-TED Talks, which is Benjamin Bratton's TED Talk, and then also Sarah Silverman's TED Talk, which is
Yeah,
taking
absolutely.
the piss.
Right?
I
Really
think we
cutting through
talked
this.
about that before. Yeah.
So that notion, right, that what we have is the creation of a false reality, which then becomes an aspirational goal, right? The objective of the vast majority of human beings is to make enough money that other people will pull the wool over your eyes about how hard this world really is. And the idea that the aspiration is to escape into a world of lies, I think, is at the heart of all of our problems. If you were rich, you could live in a world where a bunch of hard-working technocrats would ensure that from morning to night, nothing got in your way, right? Your laptop has always got its software updates done. Your email is already sorted. You have to know exactly who you're going to meet when. The food just arrives as if by magic. You never have to worry about your electricity bills. Everything is just taken care of, right? And this idea that you are liberated by degrees from the constraints of the material world by wealth until all you have to think about is this kind of like, oh, everything is lovely. How great is this, right? This is the mindset that produces the English country gardens or the Palace of Versailles or the Sistine Chapel or any of the rest of that stuff, right? Yeah. It's wealth as transcendence, and the wealth turns into transcendence because you put thick layers of hardworking people between you and the inherent gritty nature of the world. Right?
Yeah.
And this is why the black elephant is the animal of choice, right? Because it's possible to take a black elephant and ride it right the fuck through Versailles in a way that leaves nothing behind it but shattered dreams and depressed humans. And my assertion is this: if we don't get a lot more shattered dreams and a lot more depressed humans, we're fucked, right?
Yeah.
Because the Prozac and Netflix lifestyle, which has become the American norm, right? These people are sitting ducks for history.
Yeah. This is exactly, for better or worse, why, I do a lot of constructive work, but I also try to be a bit of a wrecking ball because yeah, the facade is already cracking. Everybody can see it, but they need a little nudge.
It's beyond cracking, right? I mean, did you watch this TV show Devs?
No.
Big hit.
No.
Everybody loved it. 8 episodes. It's about artificial intelligence and stuff. It's amazing, right? So one of the features of Dev is that every time the lead characters step out their front door, they have to step over a homeless guy. And when they come home, they have to step over the same homeless guy. Right? And he's like their, extra roommate. They know his name. He knows their name. They have a little chat. They step over it. Right? And that's what Silicon Valley became. Yeah. Right? Where's all this aspirational Wonderland shit? All that stuff kind of got flashed because now we've got an enormously large homeless population, and San Francisco won't allow the house prices to drop because it won't allow people to build. And so you wind up with this kind of like the system is eating its own face. But the consciousness that allows people who are stepping over homeless people to get onto the Google bus to ignore those homeless people, there's your problem.
Yeah, and you're never gonna download and intuit this information through meditation. You need to research it. You need to talk to people, read books, watch documentaries, and put yourself out there critically to rock the boat, and then you'll start to get a piece of the truth.
But it's not a complicated picture, right? You take a look at, I have this 3-website whammy, right? So there's a wealth calculator that tells you where you are in terms of global wealth distribution. Practically everybody that takes it is top 2 or 3% in the world, right? Then there's the slavery footprint site, and then there's a carbon footprint site. And by the time you get people to go through those 3 calculators, what they realize is that they're rich, entitled bastards who are destroying the future of humanity by their existence.
Yeah.
Right? And that realization is what we need at scale.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, we're the problem. Us? Yeah. I thought we were the solution. No, we're clearly the problem. Fuck.
Yeah.
I thought it was the 1%. Oh, we're the 1%. Well, maybe it's the 1% of the 1% of the 1% that are the problem. Well, actually, no, right? If you took everything that Gates and Buffett owned and you divided it equally among the top 10% wealthiest people in the world, nothing would change because all that you're doing is moving around shares.
Yeah.
Right? It's all equity in running systems, and it doesn't matter who owns those running systems. The systems will continue to function in approximately the same way. So whether those things are owned by Gates personally or whether they're owned by pension funds and it's all distributed across all the people that hold the pensions makes practically no difference in the distribution of wealth in the world. Right? It's just not how the money works at those concentrations. It's about this enormous band of overconsumption that runs right through the middle of the world. And this is the black elephant, right? It's the understanding of these bad truths clearly that enables you to spot these things, and then I think we can have the realistic conversation. Because the thing that I realized a little earlier on the call was this. So a lot of the problem with getting consensus is that everybody tells a different lie to cover up the black elephant. I think you should talk about consensus now.
Yeah, well, the first thing to say probably is, a point I make in the article is that people are threatened by the prospect of it, and they underestimate the potential, right? And when you look at the research, it suggests that consensus building can work if you set the right conditions, right? And good news for the skeptics, those conditions include making sure everybody's heard, right? Yeah. So if a person has a reservation, it's going to get integrated. and the more kind of egalitarian the process is, the more robust and long lasting the solution will be, right? So this is all good news. A lot of what I didn't include in the article purposefully is like, well, what kind of consensus are we trying to build? I alluded to it with my past critiques, but it's more than that. Like the first step for this process is to kind of like make a meta move, and let's build consensus around the concept of building consensus, right? Let's demystify that. Let's educate the whole group so we're on the same page. And then I would say the next step, or even a kind of prerequisite, is we need to learn to self-audit, right? Because there's a lot of ideology going around, and it's contagious, and this is something that, as a free thinker, you're kind of like an actual free thinker, not like the intellectual dark web free thinkers. You become kind of a pariah, for one reason or another, but usually it's because they've already excluded what you're going to say because of an assumption that they hold. Like, oh, a sociologist, you're a crazy left winger. I've already written them off.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of stuff, but yeah.
The reason they're doing that, right, is if you listen to the sociologists, there's a chain of cause and effect, and pretty soon you're worrying about homeless people again.
Yeah, and sociology is in disarray too. It's far from a consensus because there's so much, like overemphasis on empirical work and also on theory.
Bullshit.
It's very detached. It's very careerist, and these departments are continually being cut. Right, so it puts academics in a tough spot.
Oh yeah.
But let's input some content to run a simulation on consensus building. Right, let's say climate change. Right, scientifically, we already have a consensus. Right, and it's near 100%. I saw a graph that when people trot out the 97% number, that's because the 3% is actually an aggregate of like non-climate scientists, so it skews the picture a bit. But let's just say there's already a consensus, but obviously there's not a consensus among ordinary people because of the denial machine.
Bingo.
Right? So the denial machine has subverted the consensus process.
That phrase, the denial machine, that is worth the price of admission, right? I haven't heard that phrase before. I don't know whether you just came up with it or whether it's some term.
There's a lot of research on it. There's different ways to spin that label, but it is a kind of denial industrial complex. Like we all know to some extent. Even the New York Times, 2 years ago, put out a series on think tanks. How corrupted they are by their funding, right? And
but that notion of a denial machine, right?
There's anti-climate change think tanks, right? That's their purpose for existing.
But I think it's much broader than just climate denial.
Yeah.
So that notion of a denial machine, I think that there are a suite of denial machines.
Yeah.
Right? There's a denial machine that runs on tobacco. There's a denial machine that runs on climate. There are denial machines that run on homelessness. Yeah. And the homelessness denial machines are largely in people's heads, right? There's an intellectual architecture that allows people to not deal with the homeless people on their doorstep as human beings. Right? And that idea that you pinpoint, analyze, and destroy the denial machines, to me, this is the way forward. Because let me put on an extremely radical hat here for a second. I would suggest that objective truth is singular. Right? Now, objective truth is a small fraction of the truth. Right? There's objective truth, and there's subjective truth, and there's artistic truth, and there's spiritual truth, and there are many other truths. But there is a subset of truth which is objective truth, and it is the truth which is singular. Right? Climate change is a matter of objective truth. Nuclear arsenals are matters of objective truth. Homelessness, objective truth. Maternal mortality data, right? My favorite statistic for understanding societies, maternal mortality. How many of the women are dying in childbirth? It's an amazingly powerful number because it responds really quickly to changing conditions, and it tells you exactly who in the society is getting shafted, right? So consensus through shared destruction of the denial machines is almost like a mathematical process which will inevitably result in an agreement on fact, right? And this is how we get around the problem that we have right now, which is that every fucker that turns up to your meeting turns up with a different set of facts. Right? It's not just that the interpretation is different, the facts are different. And that was not true 30 years ago. 30 years ago, if I did anything political, the facts were generally agreed on. Now people have destroyed the structure of truth as they try and justify the unjustifiable. And we have to get truth back, or we are on a one-way ticket to hell.
Yeah. And in this sense, like, I like to think we're already at rock bottom, but it's debatable. It's debatable, right? So
You're so not at rock bottom.
Yeah, I'm usually the optimist. This was a point of contention with Michelle Bowens because I always want to kind of try to intervene on these things in the moment, right? For better or worse. But there's these cultural tides, and a lot of people think that the culture's just not there yet. That's why there wasn't enough of a consensus around Bernie. Even though there's all sorts of denial suppressive factors, but people, the kind of polls are clear to the extent that people want Bernie's platform, but they want Biden as the candidate, right? For whatever that's worth.
I do not understand the love of Biden. Just don't get it.
No, it's just a kind of normalization, like he's been fed to the culture for so long.
Run the standard white guy.
Yeah, but it's definitely. Part of this post-truth kind of narrative.
I mean, I can't. We're going to spend 20 minutes talking about Biden if we go down that rabbit hole. There's a bunch of stuff I really want to say, but no, let's keep on track. So,
where was I trying to get there?
We were talking about the consensus mechanisms, right? So the phenomena of everybody bringing their own facts.
Yeah, and so I wanted to say about the timing, right? Like, when is the right time? Because a lot of people still think it's not the right time. And one of the things I found with the consensus research is that, the harder things get, the better time it is to do it, right? Because there's more epistemic uncertainty.
Absolutely.
Right? And so, the consensus building project, it's anti-groupthink, right? That's another clear distinction to make.
Yeah.
But it's going to work well in an environment where there is low trust and low certainty, because through the process and through the shared resources and through the stewarding of the process, we can build up that trust and build up the consensus, right? And so we're going to build up the consensus around these meta crisis type, the problematique, if you will.
So
the herd of black elephants.
What I like about this as an approach is I can imagine this as a practical workshop, right?
A series of them. For sure.
Series of them, right? So you've got, what's her face, Joanna Macy, The Work Which Reconnects, which is like this kind of, liberal 60s model of this kind of process.
Okay.
Let's all feel our grief about the death of the world. But, it's just kind of bullshit, right? I mean, like, the thing that I'm after is, it's a bit of context, right? I mean, I've probably been homeless 3 or 4 times, right? When I was much younger, and it was kind of fun, and it was generally for short periods, or I could have gotten, somebody to buy me a plane ticket and gone home, right? There were options. I was never hardcore homeless, but I've seen what street life is like to a degree. On my father's side, my mother used to tell the story when she visited with him, the relatives that lived in one of the big Indian cities. And they had a nice little flat in a fashionable part of town. And when she was cooking, she had a brick that she put on top of the chapatis in the kitchen. Because if they had the kitchen window open to let the heat out, then the rats would run into the kitchen, grab the chapatis, and then drag them back out the window. Well, that's like late 1970s India for professional middle-class Indians living in the middle of a big city. Right? So, I have a much sharper awareness of poverty and what poverty is than I think nearly anybody who's working in these kind of fields. And this you have also, right? You've seen The Wolf at the Door. You understand where that sucker is. Ian Welsh, also had the experience of extreme poverty for a long time. And I think without that perspective, it's very hard to have any kind of global empathy.
Yeah.
Right? You just can't really get it.
Yeah.
The winners of the game are least able to understand how the game operates overall.
Yeah.
And it's exactly the kind of Marie Antoinette's Little Bo Peep act problem. Right? I mean, I spent a bit of time in Dubai, doing things like World Government Summit, and everything runs on rails and is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Like they invite you out there, they have an ocean of money, everything is paid for, your feet never touch the ground. Every 3 hours, somebody comes out with some snacks and some cold drinks, and everybody wanders around in the beautiful, beautiful sunlight under the shade with the mist cannons, and you have the utopian experience, and you go back and you do the next session.
Mm-hmm.
UK Foreign Office, right? I went to the Foreign Office one time for a meeting. The Foreign Office has like a Sistine Chapel style painted ceiling, and the entire place is covered in gold leaf, right? And it's clearly the height of the British Empire's achievement in terms of creating wonderful places to intimidate foreign dignitaries. How is anybody that operates in these environments going to understand the sheer size of the pyramid of oppression that it requires to lift them to that pinnacle of lies?
Yeah, it comes back to the denial machine too, and how different actors are like pixels in this denial machine, and they just help perpetuate it, the meta crisis. I was going to say too about poverty in the global context. Like, I've traveled to places like India and South America and Southeast Asia, and like, I wouldn't say you have to have that transformation, but almost you have to go there and see it, but not as a tourist, right? You have to eschew the tourist experience and actually give a shit, and also like think critically about how those situations arise, because there is a historical kind of global context in how the North and South hemispheres co-evolved, right? And one imperialized the other.
Namely, the British invaded fucking everything.
Exactly. So
let me throw something out there, because you said something really important there, which is you have to see it not as a tourist.
Yeah.
Right? Practically all of the Magic White Guys Save the World projects, of which Game B is one, are fundamentally rooted in an othering of the experience. Right? Yeah. This is why they're so careful to make sure that you never get an angry black person in the room.
Yeah.
Right? I could occasionally sneak in because I was light enough that nobody realized that my politics were super hardcore radical fuck you. Oh yes, Mr. Gupta, you're a disaster relief expert. And I can, yes. Right? But if I'd been black, they would never have let me into those rooms. Right? I was basically defecting on the Indians as a moral minority.
They do let people in, like Jermaine Marvel, but with a strict set of conditions, and those conditions applied to me too as a white person, right? And
so now we get to the question of what is awakening, right? And here I'm going to put on my guru hat, right? So firstly, I'm entitled to talk about awakening because I'm a member of a multi-thousand-year-old Hindu spiritual lineage. I started meditating when I was 14. I did more than an hour a day for 8 years and then got my internal dialogue to stop completely. Then I found a guru. Then after several more years of having the utter shit kicked out of me, I got enlightened.
Impressive.
26, very young. And people that really know their way around the enlightenment traditions, you're like, yeah, I was recognized as enlightened by my guru at 26, just kind of look at you like, oh my God, your life must have been shit. Yeah, it was shit, right? So, it was like get enlightened or die, and that's a very compelling argument. So this means that I have structural authority to talk about awakening, right? I have the equivalent of maybe a, I don't know, doctorate in divinity with 10 or 15 years of postgraduate study and research on the back of that.
And
I
yeah,
really know this shit, right?
That's what Martin Luther King had, right? A doctorate in divinity.
Right. So I have Hindu recognizable academic credentials as a master of the Enlightenment tradition of India, one of the branches. So when I talk about awakening, I'm talking about a specific technical process that I know how to lead people through. I hardly ever do it because I'm kind of a monster. And, like, you sort of want your guru to be a nice person, not some blood-covered ogre that lives in a mountain, right? Like, too much time with the military, too much fundamental anger. The world is dying. What the fuck are you doing about it? Is not the kind of thing you want to hear from your guru.
Right,
Oh, guru,
right,
mercy,
right.
mercy. Not until you sell your Mercedes and feed poor people. No, guru, don't make me sell the Mercedes. You're like, we can't do that, right? But when people get onto my turf and start talking about awakening and they're lying to people, I take this extremely personally, right?
Yeah.
And the thing that you are talking about is fundamentally closer to awakening than any of this horse shit that comes out of the people that talk about awakening, right? Because you know the term karma yoga?
Roughly, yeah.
So, karma yoga of doing the right thing. You do the right thing in every situation as well as you are able, and this is karma yoga. And you're constantly conscious of actions and choices.
And I think they're kind of fetishizing that exact idea with right relation, and things like that. And
don't get me started. So the falseness of that mass awakening story, right? Think of the huge amount of resources that is sunk into the idea of global awakening will save us, right? Yeah. All of the festivals, all of the workshops, all of the leaders, all the books, all of the movies, right? There's a full court press on that.
The Olympics too always pops into my head as an actual functional thing to divert conflict. Yeah.
But what I'm talking about is the spiritual side of this.
Right.
You know that kind of frequency that I'm talking about of mass awakening, collective awakening, great awakening, community, shared soul, whatever you want to think of it as, right? Unity, that imprint. So I think that is the great escape on the West Coast. It's their denial machine. And it's the denial machine of there is no requirement for us to change our lifestyles to become awakened. Right? They want the awakening to run in a completely different compartment from where their checkbook lives. And they want to believe that this constitutes a valid spirituality. It's like spirituality that exists up here, but it must never be allowed to touch the actual practical details of life. And what you're talking about of like, first you become alert to the practical details of life and you understand the world you're living on, then you build a platform of right action. This is what yoga is meant to be like. Right? Before you do the hatha yoga stuff, the stretchy postures and all the rest of that, you're meant to get the moral frameworks completely straightened out first. Because if you don't, you're going to become a monster. And I think that process of this kind of grotesque, kind of Versailles spirituality of California, I think that is actually the thing which is the biggest single obstacle to planetary survival right now. Because so many good people are being diverted down this road to nowhere.
Right.
And I don't know how we get them back other than by taking that dream away from them.
And I value these established networks only to the extent that they can change, like we're talking about, and then distribute and proliferate the values and the actual critical thinking that we're advocating.
The critical thinking, and I mean, I don't want to overstress this, but like, we're dealing with people that have never really met a homeless person. They've seen them, they might have talked to them, they might have given them money, but they've never met them. I had an experience with, a very well-intentioned person that, brought along a homeless person for dinner and, got them some food and all the rest of that stuff. And about midway through this experience, I asked the homeless person, so how did you become homeless? Right? And, the whole story unpacks. And from that come a bunch of things that we can do, which will actually help this person get their life back together. Right? But if you never take the step of saying, so how did you become homeless? None of this stuff ever runs. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, to me, until people have, and again, I hate the empathy word, but until people recognize the experience of the poor and of the homeless and of the people that are dying of diseases that could be treated if they had health insurance and all the rest of these things, until those humans pop into focus as people, I just don't see how any of this so-called spirituality is remotely valid. And that's the starting point.
Conservatives and liberals, like to they blame the victim. Obviously, they'll blame the homeless person because they're already pretending that the society structures enough to help those people if they make the right choices.
Yeah,
right? But that's not true. That's not true. And
that's your denial machine. That's how they wash their hands of the guilt.
Yeah. We've recorded an hour, so we could wrap it up here. We could keep going. I wanted to say one more thing about this homelessness, though, because we brought it up earlier, and it's just that, it is a very systemic problem and tough to solve. And I have some interactions, but relatively limited because it's hard to help people directly, right? So I've volunteered at a soup kitchen once. I've talked to a few homeless people, bought a guy a pizza once, and in that particular case, this guy told me he had a kind of government income, and then he was also begging at the SkyTrain subway station for money, and I inquired, and he's like, he told me straight up the money was for drugs. And I told him, I'm like, well, that's fine. I mean, first of all, begging's not cool, right? Because if you have the income supplement, you have a place to live, that's great. You should respect other people's kind of whatever autonomy and public space. But with the drugs, I tried to, give him a positive message. I said, I use drugs, like, it's okay, but we got to do it constructively, right? And there's other factors in your life that are making it a destructive process, right? So I wasn't trying to, blame him at all. But my point is just that there's no way I could help him. I didn't have the money to help him, So I advocate for these, structural.
An individual can't really fix a social problem.
And this is why we need consensus building, just to bring it full circle, because a lot of these social problems can be solved. We need to stop pretending that they're impossible, and pretending, letting our egos and politics get in the way, because
pretending that they're impossible is a very direct diagnosis of why these things are not getting done. Right, like eradication of world hunger is really not very expensive.
Right,
we could do that. We're just not doing it. We're pretending it's too expensive, but then it turns out to cost a fraction of the money that's going into U.S. Defense budgets.
Right.
So, I think that this idea that there is a single unitary objective truth. It's not all truth, but there is a subset of the truth which is objective. If you sit down with things like a carbon calculator or the slavery footprint calculator or the wealth calculator, you can very quickly see where you are relative to the rest of the world. You could figure out where you are in the Great Pyramid of Oppression. Like, oh, I'm 98th percentile for rich. Whoa. And I thought I was a poor person. Holy shit, I'm the aristocracy. Right? And, that awareness, like, oh, and my carbon footprint is that of 7 sustainable human beings. Right? Or 4 if you're in Europe, whatever it happens to be. Right? That stripping away that comes with just looking at those numbers generates the beginnings of an objective frame of reference from which it's possible to build consensus and possible to build unity. We will work together to get our carbon consumption down to a sustainable level, right? And at that point, all the yak, womble, womble, womble crap that comes out of people's mouths when they talk about what they're doing with their lives, it can all fuck off, because they don't understand where they are on carbon, slavery, and wealth. Nothing else that they understand is correctly grounded in reality. They're just building castles in the air because they don't understand who they are in the world they live in. Right? How can you find yourself if you don't understand who you are in the world that you're in? right? It's an
Yeah.
incredible dislocation that's at the heart of so much of this myth making. And everybody gets into the room and their myths are incompatible, but the truth, by the nature of the truth being unitary, is compatible.
Yeah.
Lies take people off in 50 different directions, but if you cut through all of that,
Yeah.
boom.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me close on the word you used earlier, which is othering, because I really like it. I really like the concept, because you're not just otherizing a general population, but like those places and other types of people, there's geniuses among them too.
Oh, yeah.
You know, there's geniuses everywhere. And so the point I want to make is that this question of who we are, fundamentally the realization is that we're all the same, right? And this, once you shed the ego and the identity in your own personal history and your own genetics, we're all the same. And we have, slightly different, like whatever abilities, but a lot of that is, environmental and socially constructed. So we're fundamentally all the same. So that's part of the consensus too. We need to build is that understanding and that actual logistical kind of systems level support for our quality.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And if we don't get on top of this stuff relatively soon, I mean, the force with which climate change and similar are going to hit.
Yeah.
Wow. Boy, howdy. Boy, howdy.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great. This is exactly what I was hoping for when we decided to do this.
Likewise. Thank you, Mr. Gupta.
It's fun.
I'll stop recording now.